What was the arts and crafts movement? Well, it certainly started in England in the mid-19th century. It was a reaction to the excesses of Victorian culture and to capitalism, to factory work. Ironically, unlike many radical movements, it was started by a bunch of intellectuals who went to Cambridge and Oxford, who were of the upper classes, but who were concerned about the value of work, of workers that were working in the factory system. So it was really about the ownership of work, as both John Ruskin and Carlyle also wrote about. In other words, the idea that a human being owns his or her own work is essential here, that a craftsperson is to be respected. So it was a reaction against badly designed products, mass-produced products of the Victorian factory system. It took an aesthetic form mainly, although it was politically a socialist movement. John Ruskin wrote a very influential book called The Stones of Venice in the 1850s, in which he basically said that medievalism was the style to be emulated in design. And he felt that way for two reasons. The first was that he thought that Gothic art used nature as its inspiration, and that nature should be the basis of all art. And the second is that he saw the medieval world as the pre-industrial world, the pre-factory world. And he romanticized that. Ruskin became the first professor of art history at Oxford in 1869, and he had a lot of disciples, or apostles if you want to say, around him. The most important being William Morris, who actually thought about studying for the priesthood, but then studied architecture instead, and became the most important designer of the early arts and crafts movement, and also a leader for socialism in Britain. Morris's company produced book designs, textiles, furniture, wall coverings, all sorts of products for home consumption. Morris preferred patterns derived from flora and fauna. Two later block-printed cotton panels, entitled Cray, exhibit the meandering, flattened, ornamental quality of 17th century Italian silks and velvets that Morris had seen in the South Kensington Museum. Requiring 34 blocks, Cray was the most complicated and therefore the most expensive pattern ever printed at Morris's Merton Abbey workshop, which he opened in 1881. Despite its cost, it was one of the firm's most popular fabrics. Like William Morris, Charles Robert Ashby also turned to 17th and 18th century vernacular prototypes in furniture and interior design. Ashby, while romantically and idealistically looking to the past for inspiration, accepted the conditions of the modern age and sought to reform its products and eliminate its wastefulness. Charles Robert Ashby's two-handled covered cup and spoon are a beautiful example of his work. Delicate finials, a cabochon on top, all emulate the sense of medieval design that Ashby found important. His metalwork was absolutely spectacular. Lauded silversmith Archibald Knox loved Celtic design. The rose bowl epitomizes the elegance of the firm's objects. The bowl is bold in form and restrained in decoration, the shapes of legs and handles effectively harmonizing with the turquoise cabochons and interlacing blue and green enamel. Ruskin's impact prompted the formation in 1848 of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a fellowship of artists, including Dante Gabriel Rossetti. As a group, these artists sought to return to the simplicity of early Italian painting, mixed with a devotion to nature and an emotional purity achieved through symbolism. Rossetti's Beata Beatrix is a prime example of this style. 10 years after the death of his wife, Elizabeth Siddal, Rossetti was inspired to create this allegorical portrait of her, which references the 13th century poet Dante Alighieri's love for Beatrice. Japan was closed until Perry opened Japan in 1854, and then a flood of Japanese objects came into the Western world. We see this with the Impressionist painters looking at Japanese prints. And this was true in America as well. Although its function is Western, Godwin's sideboard is simplified and strictly geometric. The work's primary aesthetic effect is, as Godwin wrote of the Anglo-Japanese style in general, achieved by the mere grouping of solid and void. Louis Comfort Tiffany also made use of the Japanese aesthetic in using dragonflies and peonies and different flower forms in stained glass on his lampshades. He employed a lot of women in his factory, and most of the workers who put together these complicated patterns out of small pieces of stained glass were female. And one of the heads of the department was Clara Driscoll, who designed this wonderful lamp, the hanging head dragonfly lamp, which is one of Tiffany's most favorite. And it's very Japanesque in inspiration. In the United States, the two most important promoters of the arts and crafts style and of a utopian philosophy were Gustav Stickley and Elbert Hubbard. Hubbard started the Roycrafters movement in upstate New York, and Stickley started the Craftsman magazine, which was widely read and disseminated the arts and crafts style in the United States. They too, like Morris and others of their English counterparts, were involved in book design, ceramics, metalwork, you name it. While Stickley experimented with design trends ranging from the sinuous lines and vegetal motifs of European Art Nouveau and the exquisite forms and decorative inlays of British designers, he is best known for his uncomplicated oak furniture that he himself described as simple, strong, comfortable. Stickley's enterprise was so successful that the name craftsman practically became synonymous with the American arts and crafts style. In ceramics, there was a therapeutic component. Marblehead started out as a sanitarium. Throwing pots was considered therapeutic, but eventually the director there brought in some professional potters, and it became a very successful potting company. One of the most beautiful pots in the show is the Marblehead pot made in Ipswich, designed by Anne E. Aldrich, thrown by John Swallow, and decorated by Sarah Tutt. So you can see that these were all, in a sense, ironically, sort of factory-like productions where people did have different parts to play in the production. Here in Chicago, the Tico pottery made wonderfully abstract, modern, natural forms. Tico made use of the Prairie School architecture group as well. Frank Lloyd Wright designed pots for them, and other architects were involved. And Tico pottery often showed up in Prairie School homes. Interestingly, Stickley included photographs in his magazine, The Craftsman, and very much promoted the Pictorialist movement of photography. Now, you would think that photography, produced by a machine, the camera, would be antithetical to the arts and crafts ideal. But in fact it wasn't, because photographers that were involved, heavily female by the way, felt that they were manipulating these photographs as art objects. Alfred Stieglitz, the famous modernist who ran a photography gallery in New York, also was a big promoter of Pictorialist photography, and he showed the work of Gertrude Kaisebier. And here we see Gertrude Kaisebier's portrait of Alfred Stieglitz, very brooding, very romantic, very manipulated, but incredibly beautiful. A Chicagoan, Ava Watson Schultz, was part of the Pictorialist photographic movement also, and we see here her beautiful, beautiful portrait of Jane Addams. And of course, Jane Addams was one of the most important arts and crafts figures in Chicago. She founded Hull House, was friends with John Dewey, the philosopher and educator at the University of Chicago, Oscar Lovell Triggs, who was a chronicler of the arts and crafts movement, also at the University of Chicago, and Thorstein Veblen, who the economist who wrote the famous The Theory of the Leisure Class, was also at Chicago. So Chicago was a very heady place in the 1890s. And Indian work was also very important too. Again, the Native Americans were perceived as a pre-industrial society, and if you look at Robert Jarvie's wonderful punch bowl, you can see that it is a silver rendition of a coiled Native American basket. He could well have seen these baskets at the 1893 World's Fair.